I think that it's very important for us to talk about the meetings that are going on over in Beijing. Now, the people that are getting together over there, I think you could easily call them the new axis of evil. They are doing their best to normalize the idea of totalitarianism and communism and lack of basic freedoms. And they are trying to edge out the United States as the global hegemon. That's the reason they're getting together to meet. So we have President Putin from Russia. We have President Xi from China. We have Kim Jong-Un, the supreme leader from North Korea. And we have Prime Minister Modi from India and others all getting together at this summit. Now, the ostensible reason for their getting together is celebrating the 80-year anniversary of the capitulation of Japan to China in World War II. Now, if you've read anything about what Japan did to China during World War II, it was exceedingly brutal. On October 7th, they massacred 200,000 to 300,000 people in Nanking alone. Now, I know people who say that's a complete fabrication, but those same people also say that the Holocaust is a fabrication. And so I don't know how much I can believe such people. If you really believe that the Holocaust was fabricated, you're just depraved. So I've read about the rape of Nanking. I've read about the Bataan Death March. And there's plenty of evidence that the Japanese were unbelievably brutal. And it wasn't just killing people. It was mass rapes. It was sexual slavery. It was all sorts of things like that. And now China has been pushing very hard to try to make themselves seem like that they were the great victims of World War II. And they certainly are engaging in information warfare around the world to try to shape world opinion about what actually happened. And again, there's a subset of people, especially inside Japan, who like to try to make the case that Japan was the victim in that contest, which I think is a pretty hard sell for most people. But suffice it to say, this new axis of evil that we're talking about, what their ultimate goal is to create a multipolar world. President Putin talks about it all the time. President Xi talks about it. When they say multipolar world, we want a world in which we can do whatever we want and the United States can't do anything about it. Now, since the end of World War II, the United States has been the global hegemon, and we have guaranteed freedom of travel on the high seas, in large part because of our global expeditionary navy. And so we're going to talk in a little bit about what kind of combat power this new axis bring to bear if we did end up having a conflict with Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran, or something like that in the future. And what you'll see is that it's not even close. We're still going to wipe the floor with them if it ever comes to that. And this is in direct contradiction to what Tucker Carlson has been saying, and many of his ilk, Colonel McGregor, people like that. And so I'm going to bring the receipts. I'm going to tell you numbers here to show you. Now, it will present some threats to the United States, especially economically. It will also present threats to the rest of the world and will make things much more difficult to come by, much more expensive here in the United States, and things like that. Right now, what it's doing, as the world watches President Trump's lack of foreign policy in Ukraine. He keeps flopping back and forth. We're going to give Ukraine what they need. They just gave them another $170 million worth of military equipment. We're going to be taking the handcuffs off Ukraine, let them strike deep inside Russia, which they just did. Just announced that they were going to allow Ukraine to strike even deeper into Russia with American-made long-range weapons. And then in the next breath, President Trump is throwing Ukraine and Western Europe under the bus and saying, we wouldn't have all this killing if those guys would just stop fighting, as if they're just fighting because they want to, because they like to fight. No, Ukraine is fighting an existential war. If they stop fighting tomorrow, Ukraine will cease to exist. And it will not go well for the people that live in Ukraine. So they cannot afford to stop. And we're going to talk a little bit more about the Ukraine war in the context of this multipolar world that Putin would like to see come to pass.
Crisis lies in the West's constant attempts to drag Ukraine into NATO, which, as we have repeatedly emphasized and said over many years, poses a direct threat to Russia's security. Incidentally, as a result of the coup d'état in Ukraine in 2014, the country's political leadership, which did not support Ukraine's accession to the North Atlantic Bloc, NATO, was removed. In this regard, we greatly appreciate the efforts and proposals of China, India, and our other strategic partners aimed at promoting the settlement of the Ukrainian crisis. I would like to note that the understandings reached at the recent Russian-American summit in Alaska, I hope, are also moving in this direction, paving the way for peace in Ukraine. During the bilateral meetings scheduled for today and tomorrow, I will certainly inform my colleagues in more detail about the results of the talks in Alaska. Yesterday during lunch, which our hosts organized for the participants of our SCO meetings, we already discussed this with President Xi Jinping.
The point he's making there is, because the NATO bloc kept dragging Ukraine into NATO, we just had to go to war there. Okay, now there's several things wrong with that statement. First of all, we weren't dragging anybody anywhere. Countries can join NATO if they so desire and if they can meet the criteria that it takes to join NATO. And look, Ukraine is a sovereign country. And if they want to join NATO and they meet the criteria, then they should be allowed to join NATO. And if Russia doesn't like it, that's just too bad. It is not appropriate for Russia to attack Ukraine and murder hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians because they don't like some of the decisions that the government of Ukraine was making. That's just not appropriate. You don't get to do that. And at the beginning of the war, I talked about this a lot, that it's like President Putin was a jilted lover and Ukraine wanted to break up, didn't want Russia anymore. And so Russia's stance became, if I can't have you, nobody can have you. And do you understand how just ironic it is that Russia is saying, if Ukraine becomes part of NATO, that will be a threat to Russia because we'll have NATO members right on our doorstep. Especially when you think about the fact that there were already like four NATO countries with borders on Russia. 3, and now there's 4. Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia. Now, Finland's border with Russia is enormous. So what Russia attacking Ukraine made, okay, Ukraine might have wanted to join NATO. They really were more keen to join the European Union than they were to join NATO, which is different. So Russia attacked Ukraine because of something Ukraine might potentially have done at some point in the future. And by doing so, Russia created a self-fulfilling prophecy, because when Finland and Sweden joined NATO, they dramatically increased the amount of borderland that NATO had with Russia. But there was already borderland between NATO and Russia. So it's a ridiculous statement for Vladimir Putin to say that. And I don't believe that was the actual reason that he invaded Ukraine. I think the reason he invaded Ukraine had a lot more to do with the fear of competition in the terms of oil and natural gas from Ukraine going to Europe, because the areas that they took over in the Donbass were the areas that Ukraine had proven natural gas reserves of 39 trillion cubic meters of natural gas. And the pipelines were already there. So they could have easily competed with Russia, and they could have hurt Russia's economy, that competition. Again, Russia attacking Ukraine made that a self-fulfilling prophecy. Now, Western Europe has all but stopped buying energy from Russia altogether. There's no more pipeline. They've closed down virtually all of the pipeline purchased fuel from Russia. So again, self-fulfilling prophecy. Any way you slice it, Russia had no leg to stand on when it came to invading Ukraine. And you don't get to just go kill 500,000 people because you don't like some of the political decisions that their leadership is making when they're a sovereign country. Now, if Ukraine had threatened Russia or had attacked Russia, okay, then Russia would have been justified. But they didn't. It was there before the war. Ukraine was not attacking Russia. The only fighting that was going on was mostly Russia shelling Ukraine out of those occupied territories. And in Luhansk and Donetsk. And once in a while, Ukraine would fire back as counter battery fire to try to stop that shelling from taking place. Anyway, all of this to say that this war has been very costly for Russia. The sanctions have hurt, and Russia is desperately looking for a way to get out from underneath those sanctions. So in order to do that, it's going to take some serious reshuffling of the deck, so to speak. Now, China and India are happy to assist Russia with that, because what that means is that China and India get much cheaper energy, which they very much desire. It just came out from these meetings that they're having in Beijing that China and Russia have agreed to open a new pipeline directly from Russia to China so that Russia could sell its energy directly to China. That before, that wasn't very easy to do, because in reality, China and Russia are frenemies at best. They're not that friendly. Now, they're getting tighter because they are forming their own team against the United States. But why are they working so hard to form this multipolar system? First of all, what they're trying to accomplish is they're trying to break the US-led financial system, because the US-led financial system has a lot of things in it that are to create accountability, to make it difficult to defraud people, to make it easier to track financial transactions across the globe. And those are all things that Russia and China and North Korea don't want, because in their mind, they ought to be able to cheat with impunity as long as they don't get caught. And it's much harder for them not to get caught with the US financial system ruling the world. So China's pushing an end to the petrodollar. Now, the petrodollar is not a different kind of currency. It's just the US dollar that's used to settle contracts for oil and natural gas around the world. And China and Russia, others have been trying to move away from the petrodollar for some time, and they've had some limited success with that. But even now, China and Russia and India have tremendous amounts of US dollars in their treasuries. We're talking about China alone has something like $750 billion, more than $700 billion in US dollars in its treasury. India is about the same, over 700 billion. Russia has tried to get rid of much of their US dollar denominated currency, but still has billions, tens of billions. At one point, they had over 200 billion. And of course, they're a smaller economy than China is. So by having to trade oil and natural gas in dollars, it gives the United States more leverage over those markets. It also gives the United States a way to backdoor tax China and Russia through the printing of currency here in the United States. You've heard the term quantitative easing. That's when the Fed prints currency and just injects it into the system. When they do that, it creates inflation, which means it reduces the value of every dollar that's held. As the United States engages in quantitative easing, it dilutes the value of that $100,000 so that next year that $100,000 will maybe only buy what $90,000 would buy today. So diluting the value of the dollar. And that's essentially a backdoor tax on any US dollars anywhere. So what they're trying to do is they're experimenting with settling oil contracts in some other currency, whether it's yuan, a basket of currency from the BRICS nations, BRICS bilateral settlements outside the dollar, even with crypto, stuff like that. Now, India, Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea have something in common. They all want the conflicts that you see around the world today, in the Middle East, in Ukraine, even in Venezuela, to continue. They want them to expand. They want more conflict around the world, not less. Why? Because it gives them cover. It distracts and dilutes the West, the United States and Europe. And so that gives the BRICS nations cover to carry out their own aggressive maneuvers, trying to project power and trying to create more influence around the world. Anything that costs America money is good in their mind. So if we're giving money to Israel and we're giving money to Ukraine. They love that. They want to draw that out as long as possible. Now, make no mistake, the US economy is doing much better than the Russian economy and the Chinese economy, even to some extent the Indian economy is doing. And so what that means is we can absorb a lot more pain and suffering if it comes down to it than those other countries can. And we could take a lot of steps to continue to make it more and more difficult for them to do business. So in terms of those institutions like BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and regional banks, which are trying to bypass the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the G7. Why are they trying to bypass them? Because sanctions have made it very difficult to do business. So if I were advising President Trump, I would say what we need to do is absolutely choke off those nations that want to be part of the BRICS alliance. Financially, we could continue to raise tariffs. We need to continue building our arsenals. We need to ramp it up. That's how we destroyed the Soviet Union, was by just outpacing them. We just bankrupted them because of the arms race. We're in a new arms race now, and the United States needs to ramp it up, scale artillery, scale missile production, drone production, etc.